Hello all, I'm Cameron Foster, the Program Coordinator for Millions of Conversations. Welcome to our November 2021 Conversationalist Series event, Protected Speech and American Fear. For those of you joining us for the first time, Millions of Conversations is a national organization headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Our mission is to transcend divides by uniting people around common values for a shared future, and part of how we do that is through our semi-monthly Conversationalist Series events, where we bring experts together with audiences in order to model productive conversations around crucial issues. These events are designed to be interactive, so remember to stay online after today's conversation to participate in our breakout discussions, and feel free to drop any questions you might have for our speakers into the chat box throughout today's event. We'd also like to take a minute to thank our partners at AllianceBernstein, who've generously sponsored today's event. Headquartered here in Nashville, Tennessee, AllianceBernstein is a global asset management firm providing investment management and research services worldwide. Many thanks to AllianceBernstein for sponsoring this Conversationalist Series event and for supporting the mission and vision of Millions of Conversations. This will be our last Conversationalist Series event of 2021, and it comes as we all start to prepare for the upcoming holiday season. This is an important time to focus on fostering civil dialogue, whether that's on a large community-wide scale or while you're just sitting around the dinner table. Today's event will model productive dialogue on a crucial issue: how we come together to talk about free speech, hate speech, and disinformation, and the role that each plays in democratic societies. Joining us are international affairs professional Dr. Andrew Ladley and journalist and First Amendment expert Deborah Fisher. Dr. Ladley is a former UN expert mediator and public lawyer with a background in academia, international peace operations, and coalition management in his home of New Zealand. Deborah Fisher is the executive director of the Tennessee Coalition for Open Government and the director of the Middle Tennessee State University's Chair of Excellence in the First Amendment Studies. Moderating today's discussion is Summer Ali, our founding president and CEO of Millions of Conversations. Summer, I'll turn it over to you to kick us off.
To just get the conversation going between the two of you, and if you can both be in conversation about this first question, which is, what is protected speech in America? What is unprotected speech in America? And in your opinion, and with your observations professionally and also personally, how have you seen the how it's been adjudicated in America, whose speech seems to be protected, and whose speech is, have you seen, for example, like the protected speech being for everyone, or do you see it kind of being a very gray area? It's for some people, but not for all people.
Okay, do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, kind of on the first question, about speech, it's important to remember, or it's important to actually understand that the limits on free speech have moved in America. 100 years ago, for example, it was considered illegal and subversive to speak against U.S. involvement in World War I in a way that might cause disloyalty among, military troops. So it was illegal to publish socialist ideology, and people were prosecuted for this. But courts saw this. The Supreme Court saw this as kind of dangerous to the United States, clear and present danger. That's the terminology used. But eventually, the courts interpreted the First Amendment to provide more protection for this dissent type speech. So now, speech against laws of the United States and offensive speech is protected. But there are limits on that. The incitement to imminent lawless action is a limit, but that is not, there's a difference between inflammatory speech and incitement. True threats are not protected under the First Amendment. So threatening someone or intimidating someone in a way that makes them think they'll receive bodily harm is, not protected. So like in Virginia, the Supreme Court upheld a law against cross burning, because of its threatening nature. So, other things that people are familiar with are defamation, which are basically injuring someone's reputation through, libel or slander. And that's a significant check on speech that's used. Conspiracy to commit a crime The Patriot Act actually expanded the government's ability to check in on people's communications on that without a warrant to see, to try to protect against terrorism. Fraud's not protected. And then kind of your time, place, and manner restrictions, which means like a school board can't kick you out for what you say in the public comment period, but if you show up with a bullhorn and say this meeting's over to disrupt a meeting, or you run into the U.S. Capitol to try to stop an action, that is not, you can be arrested, and people are. So I do think in terms of what's up for debate, I think that the First Amendment protects everybody equally, and protects the right to receive information as well as to speak. I know we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I do think that certainly some people want more regulations of speech. It is not uncommon to see that. President Trump wanted to change the libel laws to make it easier to basically win a defamation case. Recently, the Freedom Forum, in their annual survey on First Amendment, found that 23%, 24% wanted hate speech to be outlawed, wanted the government to be able to prosecute hate speech. So it is not uncommon at all in American history to try to want the government to regulate speech. And I think that's happened. I don't know that, anyway, we can go on about that a little bit more, but I want to give Andrew a chance to kind of jump in.
Thank you, and greetings, everybody. What's interesting about this field for me is what Deborah was highlighting, is that it's dynamic. Things change, and there's contest often over that change. And the boundaries as to what's protected and what's harmful is the key boundary that we're looking at. And as society develops, each place all over the world, they think about where should that boundary be and who should set it. Sometimes that's set socially in terms of what people consider to be good practice. In New Zealand, or just in New Zealand, as many people know, there was a massacre at some mosques, and in 2019, and nobody in New Zealand ever mentions publicly the person's name. Nobody's ever prevented that. It's simply a matter that the society says we are not going to reward you by giving you any kind of publicity for who you are and for what you've done by coming into New Zealand mosques and massacring people. So where that boundary is and the contest over it is extremely interesting. In the United States, you will know, Deborah and everybody else, that the free speech movement that started at Berkeley in 1964 encountered very hostile resistance. The key issue that it was trying to take on was simply whether or not people could discuss politics publicly at universities, on campuses in the United States. And the university tried to shut that down, and they protested. And that free speech movement was part of the broad civil rights movement of the United States. But what interests me about today, when I look at the US and elsewhere, is not this dynamic context. It's the anger that I see in the contest. And that's not new, but the scale of it is new. In Berkeley, there was a very divided campus in 1964, and indeed all over the United States. There was anger in that confrontation. And but what's happened today is that the scale of that anger, especially amongst ordinary citizens, has been multiplied and spread and become much harsher. So it's not that in a democratic society we have contest, it's about how, and about the pain and anger and indeed violence that accompanies that. So if somebody says, I want to protest my view of whether Muslims should be allowed in New Zealand, we don't accept that you can go and massacre people in order to make your point and get covered on social media when you do it. It's a criminal offense in New Zealand to cover that on social media. Now, the social media part is itself doing quite a lot to say we draw a boundary, enough. And we can talk about that a bit later, about where the boundaries are being drawn on social media and on podcasts and so on and so forth. So the core question I wanted to highlight, the core message just in these opening remarks, is that all society is struggling with this. It's dynamic, but what's interesting about where the contest is taking place, who's drawing the lines, and how angry is that conversation?
Right. So, Andrew, why do you think this question is particularly contentious in the United States? As you're saying, everybody is dealing with these drawing of the lines.
Well, it's from the outside, we see restrictions that would be completely uncontroversial in many democratic societies that constitute great agony in the United States. And we see a level of tolerance for the possibility of violence that many other societies just simply wouldn't accept. So some of this is because the society itself is angry, but of course some of it is because of the politics. And a good deal of it from the outside looking in is because of the political culture. The political culture of the US starts with a kind of resistance to the British Crown. And that kind of is written into the Constitution, trying to prevent further control by the British Crown. So it's developed a political culture saying the state can't do things, whereas many other places, the state is not regarded as hostile, it's regarded as protective. And so how the boundary is playing out in the US is something to do with the US's political history, political culture, and of course the way that that's playing out in current politics with populism and social media. But Deborah, you know much more about this than I do, and I just look at it from the outside, and we're astonished at the level of anger and vitriol that the society seems to be willing to tolerate, let alone the state. It's a very US thing. You know, you might think of it as being, the contest is everywhere, but the nature of it is very US.
Well, well, I'm not sure that I agree with the statement, or maybe I didn't hear it correctly, that the U.S. is more tolerant of violence. I think our laws do protect against violent acts. But in terms of speech, there are, limits that I talked about earlier. One of the reasons that I think we can probably agree on this, is that it has become so contentious is honestly the introduction of social media and the platforms and their ability to basically track your every move and what you look at, and use algorithms to repeat, to feed you or allow you to see propaganda, disinformation, whatever you want to call it, and to kind of, wind everybody up, and into different camps. And these platforms, there's been talk about, should big tech be regulated? And that's a big issue in the United States right now, and questions about that. And that's why you see them sort of self-regulating, because they don't want to. They don't want to get rid of their protections that they have. So, for example, some of the limits that we talked about in terms of First Amendment defamation, right? Libel. If a newspaper publisher were to print a letter to the editor that someone else wrote that is libelous, or take your pick, they can be sued. But these social media platforms have protection on that because they're seen as platforms and not necessarily as publishers. So there is a difference there. So there are lots of technical things about the law that I think are being sort of hashed over, I suppose, at the congressional level. So I think that's why it's become more contentious, because, or that it is contentious, is because, there's so much amplification in the social media world. And we've seen, lots of it, I guess, disinformation, propaganda, really flowing through those channels.
Yeah. Um, in terms of tolerance of this, again, this is just an observation. What one sees from the outside, and of course, I regularly pre-COVID was in the United States, including in Nashville, and but what one sees from the outside is a social level of acceptance of violence, and a political level. And people say this is not so bad. And you would never, in many places, be able to get away with saying I'm a public figure and I think I can do various things to women or someone else. And you would never be able to get away with that in many societies and say people would say, good on you, you've been a good bloke. You would never get away with that kind of thing in terms of the social and political acceptance of it. So yes, I agree, of course, that not everybody this applies to, and no question about that. But this is a central area of contest. And from the social point of view, one doesn't have to wait for the laws to do this. An individual and a society and a group can say, we don't like that. And not only do we not like that, we are not going to tolerate it in us doing it. We're not going to contribute to it, which is, I think, one of the strengths of what Millions has been trying to do. It's just to say we're not going to wait for laws. We're going to say as a people, let's draw our own boundaries of humane and treatment and of how we're going to use our speech. The social media giants know this. Every single one of them is trying to regulate harmful speech. They're doing it in different ways and they're doing it with different success, but you can no longer carry snuff videos, which is essentially what the Christchurch massacre was, live on Facebook. And at least there should be some way to doing that. I'm quoting now from a recent article in the United States. There's lots of public radio stations doing amazing work to spread good health. On the other side, we're seeing mostly the AM radio dial and their podcast counterparts being the Wild West of the airwaves. Now, what we're seeing is that the gradual attempt to regulate is moving from the major platforms into the podcasts and so on. iHeart has got rules that prevent statements that incite hate, promote Nazi propaganda or defamatory. Apple's content guidelines prohibit content that may lead to harmful or dangerous outcomes or that is obscene or gratuitous. Spotify, 299 million monthly listeners, prohibits hate speech in its guidelines and prohibits content that promotes dangerous, false, or dangerous deceptive content about COVID-19, and so on. So, I mean, there's a lot of this that's happening, and it's being done by society, not just by the federal government, saying, enough. We can see that there's a limit, and that limit hurts if people go beyond it. So what I mean is not that the whole of America tolerates this more than anyone else, but that by and large, when one looks from the outside, one sees a level of tolerance for this that many other places, Western democracies, simply have already dealt with long ago because it's too painful. Sorry to go on.
That's very interesting. Building on that, I guess, Deborah, if you want to take the first few minutes on this, and that is, what do you think is the relationship between fear, otherization, and the conversation like we're having about free speech in America? I feel like we're touching on it a little bit here.
Yeah. Well, again, and just to go back to what Andrew said about sort of our own ability to self-regulate. I mean, the thing about free speech in America, we got to remember, is what the First Amendment prevents is the government creating laws to restrict your speech. So that's why Facebook, social media, YouTube, whatever, can look at what they consider, what they want on their platforms and not allow certain things. So that's an important distinction in terms of, when you're thinking about the First Amendment, and then when you're thinking about the culture in general and our ability to as a society, determine that some things should be off limits. And I do think that there is a conversation going on in the United States right now that is very and happening, probably from organizations like yourself, that is very much trying to, uh, maybe move us. I mean, I think if we always try to move toward enlightenment, we have to have our minds open to hear different viewpoints. And I think there is a conversation going on about otherism and how we view that, and the history of the United States and where that, how that has, how we were taught that, and things that we didn't learn growing up about the history of the United States. So there's, I think it's important that we have those other viewpoints. In terms of fear, I do, I do think there's real fear out there. Frankly, there's fear if you look at sort of just two sides in America or whatever. I think there's really fear on both sides about, what ideas and thoughts will be prominent in the United States. But I think the fear to be concerned about is, violence. That's the thing that is, unacceptable.
Fear and otherization. Exactly as you're saying, Deborah, this is a conversation in the United States. It's a long conversation, and it's been going on in different ways, for all of the US history. When I look abroad and at different places, what I see is a very stark recognition that there's a path that once you start saying that this person is an enemy, this person is, the colloquial language is to demonize. Now, that has a very deep history. It has a deep history in Western society. People will know the accusations that were made that people were witches and so on. And once you call them that, by definition, you demonize. Once you put them on a scale that they're an existential threat because they're connected somehow with the devil, you demonize. You can do anything to them, burn them, hang them, kill them, and of course ostracize them. America's founding on the East Coast, the Northeast Coast, in some ways, in terms of modern America and the Pilgrims and various others came over, was precisely because of this. Was because people feared being accused of obviously religious threats, for which people were killed. That whole Protestant revolution in Europe, which really was built around the capacity of people to read, so that they started making alternative interpretations of their access to God. That contest over who could make what interpretations produced deadly accusations of being demons. Now, and then people had to flee or be killed. So this is a very long history, and there's nothing new in particular that's playing out in the United States. But what I see is, again, a kind of proliferation of it when I look from the outsides, in which people don't seem to realize the trajectory that they're on, at least, or don't seem to care. There doesn't seem to be enough understanding that if I call my neighbor a demon in any form, that I am inviting the other neighborhood to go after that neighbor. And that one thinks, well, it's fine, free speech. I can call my neighbor a demon in any form. I can say that they're rapists. I can say that they're blue, green, yellow, whatever. I can say they're dangerous. If I do that, I'm inviting my neighbors to join with me and go after them to protect the neighborhood against the demon. Now, that's the otherization that starts soft and ends deadly. That is such a big risk in any society, anywhere, always has been across all of humanity. It just happens that the US and social media, exactly as you were saying, is playing this out in a kind of hyped up process, which is extraordinarily dangerous. And that's why it's crucial to recognize the risks to talk about them, exactly as you're saying, to put clearly on the table that if you start down this track, at the end of it is a very, very dangerous process. And it's not the violence at the end only that one fears. It's the fact that people are moving down that line. And once you start moving down it, you suddenly find yourself amongst people who are committing violence. And actually, 6th of January this year, the 6th of January event in Washington, D.C. is an example of that. People start down the road and suddenly find themselves attacking police officers in front of them. And so for me, what's interesting is to highlight the road that people go down and its beginning, which starts from otherization, and its end, which is very deadly. But progress down that road requires people to recognize that speech can lead people down that road. And you have to be aware of it. Now, who draws the line? As you're saying, Deborah, exactly, well, the state does draw that line for all sorts of reasons, such as, the sort of criminal offenses and the range of other things. The state does draw, but how far the state draws that is the big contention. And in some places, the state draws that line to repress. And that's in some countries, that's the fear that America has. In other places, the state draws that line to protect. And the key for America and anywhere else is, and indeed for us each personally, is where to draw that line and who's going to draw it.
Right. Well, and I think what you said about the state drawing the line really is the question. I totally agree with you that speech has consequences. And, I remember growing up and learning, if you think something, then you say something, then you do something, I don't know if that was a biblical thing or just something, that it sort of takes you down that line. So, so that's why you need to, think about your thoughts, right? And think about what you say, because anything you say has consequences. Some of that is a legal consequence for you, but some of that is just an ethical consequence for you. But some of that could get you ostracized, and in our culture, if you demonize or whatever, we're talking about the cultural checks that we have on our conversation. But I think in terms of disinformation, and in terms of the demonization or things like that, it still is, I think the fear in America, as you mentioned, or the thing that prevents government from drawing a harder line to say you can't say these things, or this will be illegal, or this is, there is the true threat, but if this is illegal, is that people, it's still compelling that people should be able to judge what is true or what is false about what is said, and not the government, deciding what is true or what is false. And so, in terms of propaganda and disinformation is trying to influence public sentiment, I do think that it's compelling to Americans to be able to have a right to receive information. But, there's no question that demonizing other people and some of that level of rhetoric that takes place, even among our leaders, is offensive. It's offensive. I don't like to see it, and I don't think most Americans do. And I think you start seeing some pushing back on that. It is a slow moving train, but we see pushing back on that from Americans, I think.
I'm particularly interested in, and have been, my recent research has been on external powers' capacity to exacerbate this conversation and to exacerbate fear. And in particular, my focus has been on where places are in turmoil already, trying to work out what the social media scene both enables and is manipulated to do. Now, it enables something because of the algorithms and so on, and that doesn't necessarily involve a hostile power, but sometimes it involves a very deliberate attempt to manipulate it, and by external powers who create false bots and accounts and who pick up particular storylines and exacerbate them. Now, that's an interesting discussion on its own as to who's doing it and why. And there's a lot of research about who's doing this in different countries. My main focus is nothing to do with America. It's where different conflict places are having their issues levered up by external powers using social media. But so that's not, I mean, it does happen in America, as we know. You've got congressional testimony and lots of evidence to show external powers trying to do the same thing in America. But that's not my primary focus of research. What I am interested in is first of all trying to work out who's doing this domestically, and secondly to work out the power of amplification and how it works and why. Why does it work that if somebody gets some information that says that something else is happening that they disagree with, that they think that the appropriate response is to go and kidnap the governor of Michigan and hold him hostage? And how does that work? How does it work that ordinary citizens find themselves locked into a story that they think it's appropriate to take violence to do? And that, I think, is a really interesting conversation. It's interesting in America. My primary focus is on it taking place elsewhere. Why is it that in particular places that I've been trying to work at, I can't and haven't been for a year and a half or two, for obvious reasons, internally, but I've been doing it in terms of research, trying to understand these processes. And
what do you
sorry.
No, go ahead, Andrew. I was going to kick that question over about the conversation you were saying that you wanted to have around it to see what Deborah's thoughts were. But yeah, go ahead.
But let me pause there. I mean, the point is that I'm interested in studying this and in making sense of it. And in the American context, every bit of research I see sees American researchers try to do the same thing. What is going on? Who's doing it? What is the power of amplification? And what are its risks? And how do people get trapped? People get trapped in their bubbles and they stop believing in anything resembling which you might call factual truth, and they start believing received truth that they find. And that becomes their truth. And it becomes their truth and they're prepared to use violence for it. That, I think, is an extremely interesting dynamic. I know you're thinking about this, Deborah. I'm sorry, I was just trying to clarify my thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know why people are radicalized, and what makes people more susceptible to that. It's I don't know. I suppose that people are isolated. There is this amplification through social media. There are these algorithms, we've learned about that tends to, feed you things that you like, and it kind of goes from there. But I don't know. I mean, that is sort of beyond, I suppose, it's sort of beyond free speech. But I will talk a little bit about transparency and open government, which is an area that I'm really interested in, and access to information about government and how it's operating is, it's been said to be the currency of democracy. That wasn't my term; somebody else came up with that. But in terms of, for people to be able to participate in government, they need information about what their government is doing, and so that's where, I mean, since the beginning of America, that's been baked into our constitutions. I mean, the laws, the public records laws, the FOIA laws, all that stuff are, developments in the last half of the century, that are the machinery that make that work. But that's been this idea of transparency. Now, I think one tension between the First Amendment and transparency laws has to do with disclosures, and it's specifically elections and campaign finance disclosures. And that's where you see, there's some people who want to know more about that manipulation or the dark money or anything that's coming into campaigns that then fuels some of these, the information that gets put out in the political races. And some people think, no, you should be able to contribute to a candidate, and you have a right to privacy in that area. So I do think there is this tension about it, and the Supreme Court's weighed into this, obviously, but there is a tension there between disclosure. And I do think that that's something that will continue to be a struggle, but inside government, in terms of like individual people's lives and why they're radicalized and how that happens. I mean, all of that is definitely part of the conversation. I'm just not sure how. I'm not sure how you would propose eliminating that.
Let me just build for very quickly on what you've said. Part of what I see taking place in the United States and elsewhere is precisely to expose it. In other words, to research it, to document it, to say who's doing it, to analyze the effects on the human brain. It put very simply, if you tell someone that someone's an enemy, your brain reacts with a different part of it, which is about fear, and which binds on to the need for protection much more quickly. So there's research about the effect on the brain. There's research which I think should be better understood. There's research about the effect on societies. There's the publication of how this is taking place is a crucial part of the protection against the risks. And the whistleblowers from Facebook saying, why are you doing this? And why are you still allowing this to take place? That's crucial. And it's crucial that people understand why it is that this is being done in such a way. Incidentally, the fact that foreign powers use this so effectively is because they've done the research and they know exactly how this works. And therefore, they're able to use it and to great effect. And that was very clearly done in the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. It's been done in a host of elections in Europe. My particular focus has been on Eastern Europe and on the Middle East in terms of where it's being done to manipulate opinion. And it's what you say is crucial. It's exposing of it by proper research, which explains how it happens. On a public level, it's crucial that the state requires similar publicity. Who's doing it? Who's paying? Who's contributing? And it's crucial because that helps the ordinary citizen, as you said, who's entitled to the information, to know and to make their own judgments about how it's happening. So I think you're right. Transparency, sunlight in the metaphor is a crucial part of this. What's going on and who's doing it, and that I think helps.
And I'll just throw out there, I mean, I do think it's important to get to the truth, and that's a process. But I mean, I think you see that playing out right now on the January 6th, attack on the Capitol. And was there, a coordinated effort inside the White House to make what happened happen? And we don't know the answer to that. I know a lot of people think they know the answer to that, but we don't really have all the answers. And there is, in terms of transparency, there's a tension right now between the executive privilege of the president, or now former president, to keep the memos and documents and so forth confidential, and the Congress, who wants access to those to see if there's anything there that would show that connection, and so I do think that, and this came, this executive privilege came up again, go back to Nixon, that's when it first, the Watergate tapes and so forth. But that kind of tension between, in this case, executive privilege and the ability to know if, what happened there with the president and his advisors is an example of getting to the truth of the matter in some instances. And I'm not sure how that's going to turn out.
The Pentagon Papers, right?
The Pentagon Papers, yes, but the tapes, the tapes of Nixon, yes, the Pentagon Papers too, yes. all. But the tapes of Nixon in the White House, listening to those, that was an executive privilege assertion that was overcome.
Thank you.
Muted.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, this was really, really enlightening. I think I would just say one more quick question for you to discuss before we go into breakout session. And that is, should we change in the United States what is qualified as protected speech and unprotected speech?
Small question for you, Deborah.
Oh, for me? Oh, well, keep in mind, it is, as Andrew pointed out earlier, it is a dynamic situation because if you look at 100 years ago, it was not protected to be able to say certain things about the World War I, and so that dial has moved. And I think that, honestly, there are still a lot of avenues. And I think we have to be very careful. Just if you look back, you have to be very careful about handing government control over what can be said and what can't be said, because that is a double-edged sword. I know that people think, oh, well, it's just going to be about stuff I don't like being said, let's outlaw that. But it's a double-edged sword, and I think that's why Americans have been reluctant to, and the court, really, the Supreme Court, which interprets the First Amendment and the Constitution, has basically come down on the side of free political speech. But there are limits. And I think sometimes the understanding in America about free speech is I can say anything I want and do anything. It's not really that way. There are limits to it that I mentioned at the very beginning.
I'd make two comments on your question, Samal, and just building on what you're saying, Deborah, the double-edged sword. What I see looking at America from the outside is that Americans are much more interested in one side of that cutting edge than in the other at this time. And so I am interested to know where that boundary is going to be drawn and by whom. And in terms of speech that harms. In New Zealand, we have a test which says that the limits must be the limits that are demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. They must be prescribed by law and demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And then, of course, that's the test for the court. What is demonstrably justified? So that it protects you against the attempt by a state to say, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to let you know who's voting for whom. And it protects you against hate speech, and which people might say is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society to know that if you say my neighbor is a demon, that has the risk that person will be injured. And so the second thing I'd say about where that limit is and should there be a limit is, I think, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, I think each of us, anywhere in the world, but each of us can look at this and to say, actually, we aren't going to tolerate this personally and collectively. In other words, so where should there be limits? I think that's the importance of a social conversation, to say, as a society, we're going to decide what it is that we find acceptable, and we're going to talk about it. Because if we don't talk about it other than by assertion and by demand and by claim, then it becomes very difficult to hold the conversation, because all you've got is a series of shouted assertions. And what I feel is that that's the risk that I see, is that people become so exercised about existential threats that it becomes very difficult to have a conversation about, is that really fair, and is that kind, and is that something which is going to help my neighborhood, or is it something which is going to hurt it and hurt people in it? And so I think that rather than just waiting for the state, the importance that I see everywhere is of societies having conversations about whether or not that's acceptable to them and why, in a decent way.
That's great. Thank you, Andrew. Well, thank you, Deborah, as well. We're going to get a chance ourselves now to go into breakout rooms and have conversations and to talk about the conversation we just witnessed, and also to engage in conversation. And then we will come back in all together and have a chance to ask Deborah and Andrew, Ms. Fisher and Dr. Loudley, any questions that we might have, and to share also some of our own conversations that we're about to have, and to build on those in the last 15 minutes of this discussion.
Right, so I'm going to go ahead and open breakout sessions for everybody. There should just be a message popping up on your screen letting you know to join your breakout, so just make sure to click that button, and we'll reconvene after about 15 minutes. Hey there. I'll be returning from breakouts right about now. Just like to take a couple minutes to invite folks to share any thoughts that they had or that they breakouts that they thought were particularly insightful or relevant to this conversation. So please.
Just a little light Thursday afternoon conversation.
Can I say something then?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So in our group, we're Chris Ruiz, Allison Ingalls, and John I, and me. And one of the things that came up was that there was the insider point of view, the Nashville person, and the outsider point of view, the New Zealand person, and in our with our speakers, and that they navigated that very nicely. They didn't get stuck on that. They disagreed and they were able to voice the disagreements, but they didn't get stuck on it. They were able to move on to other thoughts and reconcile their disagreements. And we thought part of that was because they were prepared for the conversation. They had to know some of these things would be coming up. The other big point that I thought was important to mention in the big group here is there was more emphasis on the individual's responsibility from the United States side, and more emphasis on the state's responsibility from the New Zealand side. And so that stood out to all of the members of our small group. And then to move forward, there were several points that were all made about having more face-to-face and local conversations, because it's more difficult when you're face-to-face with someone. It's more difficult to be hateful if you're having a conversation around a dinner table or in a public square. Now, that's not always true, we know, but
Yeah. Well, Deborah, Andrew, did you guys want to say anything on that in terms of those observations?
Deborah?
Andrew? No. Yeah, that maybe it's, what you said in terms of being able to have a conversation, a civil conversation. I mean, obviously, that's going to happen here, I hope. But I think it's interesting, and I've learned something from Andrew a lot. We had also a conversation before this event, but it's really interesting to me to hear, someone looking in, and also what happens in other countries, because I think we do need to think about our own society, and you do have to kind of open your mind up and listen. And I think that's a really important concept. So I appreciate the conversations that we've had and the insights that I've heard from Andrew. So
thank you, Deborah, and thank you to our previous speaker. And I think you're exactly right in drawing attention to the fact that I concentrate a bit more about on the state. and focused a bit more upon individuals and societies in the US. I just like to explain a little bit about that. Partly, I think my emphasis on individual and social responsibility on the state is because, on society. Partly my focus in America is because I think there's a risk that people throw up their hands and say this is all legal and this is all up to governments. And I'm trying to emphasize that we as ordinary people can draw our own boundaries, and we should do so carefully and thoughtfully and in the kind of conversations we have. So I'm trying to stress in America that in my analysis looking in, the risks are so big that it can't just be left to wait for the Supreme Court and for the playing out of the First Amendment and for what the politicians are going to do. And so that's the reason I kind of emphasize that. In relation to other places where I emphasize the role that government can play, my goal really is to emphasize that democratic governments draw these lines without a great deal of pain in other places, with still guarantees of protection of free speech, and they draw them because they recognize a bit more the harm side of things. And so if the First Amendment in the United States had that this amendment is subject to rules prescribed by law, demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society, you would have very different legal conversations. But actually the political conversations in other places at state level are different. And all I'm trying to do is to highlight that from the outside, I see a very American view of this playing out, that in other places they've wrestled with differently. And that's all I'm trying to highlight. And I just particularly want to highlight that there is a long history of free speech curbs being used to repress. And that's not what I'm talking about. I know that that's the double edge of the sword that you were speaking about, Deborah. And I just want to acknowledge that is no question, that is a major issue. But I was not focusing on that. I was focusing on the other side of the sword, which is the protection side. Sorry, but thank you so much for your comment.
We talked a bit about, again, I guess this is bringing a little bit of an international perspective, that in, maybe standards, both legal and societal, in other societies that may be more successful, look when they're sort of developing criteria for what's acceptable, look beyond just mere threats of physical violence, but also to questions of threats to, individual psychological well-being. And we had, I don't know if it was really a disagreement, but there were clearly different perspectives in the sense that I had brought up some recent cases in universities where, students essentially, because someone had a differing political perspective, were saying that they were sort of, triggered, by the fact that an organization was going to be allowed to, have an event or something. And then that is very, dangerous. And yet at the same time, people do go, into sort of unacceptable bounds, such as our congressman from Arizona, who yesterday, was censured for doing threatening things to a fellow congressman, and that, those sorts of norms don't need to be legal, they should be societally imposed. So it's always going to be a tension, I think. And the notion to sort of bring in this view of sort of psychological harm, I think you have to be careful about that when you bring that into your legal system, but you can clearly try to build upon it in organizations when you're talking about what does it mean to have respectful interactions, respectful versus saying you can't say something, but how do you say something in a respectful way, even if a lot of the other people in the room disagree with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am so sorry to do this, but Dr. Thornton, I am so curious to hear your thoughts on this conversation, to pull you in a little bit
First
too.
of all, I was egregiously late to the conversation, so I gratefully indulged Karen and Teresa to, bring me up to speed with their analysis. And I think something that was just said by Lori that really got my juices flowing around when political discourse itself becomes, synonymous or too proximate to fomenting hate. As a Black woman in America, I can think of a variety of things that would be considered political participation that on their very face, like marching by the hundreds with white hoods on down, main roads in Washington are intended to send a particular kind of message to a particular group of people about, with the intent to, if not directly produce harm, create a kind of fear that keeps people from feeling like they can equally participate. And I think one of the things we talked about that I really appreciated was this notion of, I'm going to call it grace. I think Karen and Teresa called it forgiveness, but this notion that there is a real difference between coming from different places and seeing things differently and having different sensitivities, and being willing to kind of accept accountability despite our intentions for something that may negatively impact another of our fellow human beings. And being in a place where certain types of political participation become synonymous with what I would, and we'll just say have heard people who I literally agree with politically on nothing otherwise would, I think, agree with me to say don't belong in democratic, mainstream, political discourse or should not be constituencies that any of us who are trying to be part of a vibrant democracy should be, aligning ourselves with. And, I give the KKK example, but I think there are other examples, that we could hearken to. So I feel like I'm not a lawyer, so I don't think about this in a lawyerly way about what the arguments are that get presented to judges. But there's sort of a human element here to me that says, certain things, are really, focused on, take us beyond disagreement into a dangerous space that, that I hope is not the space where we want to exist in the future. And I think we had such a wonderful open conversation about a range of perspectives on, the role of the state versus the role of us as individuals, the value and the vibrance in disagreeing without being disagreeable. And I don't know, I think I'm just grateful to the two other members of my breakout who did more educating of me than anything else in the process. But I do still have these kind of, for me, there are some clear, black and white, boundaries of danger. But again, I'm not dealing with this on a day-to-day basis in terms of how we draw those lines. So I know when you're in a field, it's harder and harder when you get to those edges to make a clear delineation in where the line is.
Well, I think a more recent example was what happened in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
When you had the march there and people were basically saying things, we will not be displaced, and
right.
both making both anti-African American and anti-Semitic remarks. And, I agree with you, Dr. Thornton, that I would like the world to be a place where we don't have that. but again, as a lawyer, I sort of, see that that certainly is within the bounds of, our First Amendment to allow for those sorts of gatherings. I mean, and obviously where it goes off the rail is when people actually then do take, violent action. And right now there's a civil case now, of the people who, were behind in organizing those marches, and they're being sued civilly. And I think the gentleman who fortunately killed the young woman, I think he is now been incarcerated for that.
Elise, you had something. I see you come off mute. You came off mute.
Yeah, if I may just jump off this particular conversation, I think it's important for us when we're talking about the impact, like Dr. Thornton was mentioning, the impact of certain behaviors, certain types of speech on the community. When we're talking about the history of the KKK, for example, and we're talking about the history of Confederate monuments and things that do create, like Dr. Thornton was saying, a certain psychological space where certain populations are living in fear of violence. I think what's really important is paying attention and highlighting the history of that and where that comes from. And this is not just a group of people coming together to, share their perspective on a particular topic of the moment, but this has a very concrete history in ways that have created systemic violence that we have not reckoned with on a large scale. For example, from my hometown in Richmond, we have an avenue that goes through the city called Monument Avenue, lined with Confederate monuments. And last summer, those started to come down after a lot of protesting. But I think what was really important and lost in a lot of that conversation was that the history of those monuments and when they were erected and by whom they were erected. They were erected in the 1920s when the Richmond government was overrun by the KKK. And it had a very clear and intentional purpose in terms of who was around, who was allowed to be around in certain spaces and who was not allowed, and what would happen to them if they were around. And then the second round of monuments was put up in the 1950s when schools were beginning to be integrated. Again, another fear tactic to try to keep people from engaging in the public square. So I think that those things are really important, as we haven't had a large scale racial reckoning in the United States. And to keep in mind that the First Amendment, and our laws are not doctrine that we need to adhere to for the rest, of our existence. These things are malleable, and we also know that the history of it can be very violent. So, how are we going to reframe some of our standards and expectations as a society around how we want to be different moving forward?
And I was hoping Pam could share some of her points. Thank you, Elise, some of your points that you made in our session, because I thought that's really relevant here.
I think bouncing off of what both of our speakers said, I'm struck by the importance of all of us working at the local and municipal level to start conversations, that helpful conversations, as a Summer would say, through the training that needs to happen in order to move from the local level out. I don't think we're going to have success until we start at the local level and work out. I think the forces are too big at the national level and too well funded and organized to have listening, effective listening and sharing take place. When they any group of more than 150 needs a leader. And that has been proven throughout history. Nicholas Christakis has done a lot of work on that and has written several books on the subject. And when we as human beings can get to that granular level, it's like when somebody from a different ethnic background moves into your neighborhood. All of a sudden you learn that these people that you never interacted before, wow, they're just regular people and we all get along. It's just fine. I think it's so important if we can start working through the local level and work forward from there.
Absolutely. Well, you will not get any pushback from us on that for Millions of Conversations, for sure. Well, in our last 4 minutes, I was wondering if Deborah and Andrew, if you all from just listening in on the conversation here had anything else you might want to add.
You know me well enough by now, Deborah, to know that I'm going to say Deborah.
No, I was going to, no, you go first.
Well, I am extremely interested and worried about the sort of cancel culture type culture wars debate in which people will feel such an existential threat to something that they will say, we simply aren't going to let you talk or anything else. And the other way around, that people who feel that they have a big threat to their way of life will do their best to prevent any discussion. I mean, I do think that it is possible that even these aren't moral equivalences in terms of right and wrong. I think that I would take personally a stand and say, I can understand if people want to stop somebody speaking if they represent something. But I do think that navigating that is part of the key challenge.
Yeah.
And we need to do so in a way that is decent, humane, respectful, but without saying that any point of view is okay, any point of view, because we do need to attach the hurt to it. And I'll just give you a tiny anecdote. In the 1990s in New Zealand, we had a rush of migrants that New Zealand had accepted from collapsing government and situations in the Horn of Africa, mainly Somalia, when it collapsed, and close to Ethiopia. And one of our politicians who formed a political party called New Zealand First, which will tell you where he was coming from, went on national radio and said, New Zealand can't accommodate these desert cultures. And it was code. It was a dog whistle. It was code. And that night, a member of the public threw a brick through the window of one of the recent migrant families. I and a number of others went on radio the next day, and very widely heard, and said, we hold this person directly responsible. There's a direct link between an authorizing environment that they've created by this kind of othering language and the events that took place. And you know, it had an enormously powerful effect in New Zealand. The politicians in New Zealand do not do this kind of thing by and large. It's largely changed the political culture because there was such a backlash from ordinary society to say, let's not do that. I mention the anecdote not because of my tiny role in it, but because I do think that it is possible for an engaged society to hold discussions about where it is that we think that speech hurts and why. And I think it's really important to look at that and to unravel some of the issues instead of people getting into existential threats saying, if you take down my monument, I'll no longer be a person. I think it is really important to try and look at that and say, how are we going to unpick this so that people don't respond existentially and instead respond as citizens, and about issues that, as Elise said, are really quite graphically linked with pain and hurt. And it's interesting to do that in terms of intellectually. It's crucially important to do that in terms of each society. And I commend hugely those of you who are engaged in this, and thank you for letting me be a small part of your conversation.
And I think that we are in a moment in our American history of where we are having conversations about the hurt or, our own history. And I think that is good. I mean, that is something that, we should open ourselves up to listening to each other, and to not just, go into our camps. And I think that part of the reason that this conversation is happening is because of the escalation of the conversation that has happened in the past 4, 5, 6 years, largely fueled by the ability to have a platform, on social media, and to spread information so quickly and it's such a big, fast way, and also some of the violence that has erupted that has concerned everyone. I mean, you mentioned the Charlottesville, but that was. I remember before that there was a professor that had a tweet. I think I wrote a column about it at the time, that talked about running over people, running over protesters or something. And, it was alarming that, you would tweet that out, and yeah, maybe it was protected, maybe it wasn't, an imminent threat, but you began to see this tone of this, willingness to kind of go over the line in thought, that something might be acceptable as a defense, perhaps. And so I think we have to be, really careful about that kind of thinking. I do think, though, that people, if you don't come together and talk about some things, if you divide into camps, you're not going to get anywhere. You have to find common ground. And I think that, I've learned that in my work at the legislature, is that you have to find common ground. And sometimes people are surprised that it does exist. And so you have to have that conversation to move forward on some of these issues. I, remain faithful, or I remain thankful for free speech in America, and that the state does not govern it in such a way that would limit, disagreement, but with political or whatever structures. So I think that still is strong and good, and I think the limits that the Supreme Court has put on it through time have been appropriate. It is a moving issue, but I do just want to encourage, though, that people do need to come together and find common ground, or I don't think we'll get anywhere on any of this.
Right. And with that, unfortunately, we're hitting time for this event. So I just want to thank you all for attending, and huge thanks to our panelists, Dr. Andrew Ladley and Deborah Fisher, as well as our sponsors for this event at Alliance Bernstein. Before we close out today, please take our pledge to listen if you haven't done so yet. I dropped a link to that and our listening facilitator in the training before, and I'll just do so again now. If you're interested in getting involved in participating in our upcoming training for community listening facilitators, the link is right there. So keep an eye out for our end of year wrap up, which will be going live next month. Our Conversationalist series will resume in February 2022. Until then, have a great holiday season. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Thanks.